Off the coast of Antarctica, deep underwater, researchers have discovered the British ship called Endurance.
If we look at the chart, here we have it right here. This is where she sank. This is X marks the spot.
Deep beneath Antarctica's frozen seas, one of history's most enduring mysteries has finally been uncovered. Shackleton's legendary ship, the Endurance, missing for over a century, has been found.
It's as fresh as the day the ship went down. You can see her paintwork, you can see the bolts, you can see the ship's name. This was a great discovery.
Yet what rests on the sea floor is both haunting and awe-inspiring. With advanced underwater robots, explorers braved crushing pressure and extreme cold to uncover a scene that speaks of human endurance, courage, and nature's unforgiving might. But what exactly did they find? And could it rewrite everything we thought we knew about Shackleton's fateful voyage? Shackleton's dream, the last great journey. Before he became one of history's most celebrated explorers, Ernest Shackleton was simply a man who refused to live an ordinary life. Born in Ireland in 1874 and raised in England, he spent his boyhood dreaming of faraway horizons and icy frontiers. At 16, while most teenagers were worrying about school or apprenticeships, Shackleton joined the Merchant Navy. The sea became his classroom, his proving ground, and perhaps his greatest love. By his 30s, Shackleton's restless ambition had carried him to the edge of the known world. He joined Captain Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery expedition in 1901, a brutal but enlightening experience. He learned the language of the ice, the silence of the white wilderness, and the weight of frostbite on human will. But he also learned something more important: how not to die in Antarctica. That, as it turned out, was a valuable lesson. This was the dawn of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, when men raced each other to plant flags in places no one had ever seen. It was a time when the words scientific curiosity and national glory went hand in hand. While Scott and Amundsen battled for the South Pole, Shackleton had a different vision, one grander, riskier, and far more audacious: to traverse the entire Antarctic continent, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, a staggering 1,800-mile journey across the most hostile environment on Earth. The newspapers called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Shackleton called it the last great journey left to man. To him, this wasn't just an expedition, it was destiny. The world was on the brink of the First World War, but Shackleton's eyes were fixed on a different kind of battlefield: ice, wind, and endurance. His goal was to show that British courage could outlast even nature itself. In his recruitment advertisement, if the famous version is to be believed, it read like this: "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Whether or not Shackleton actually printed that ad, one thing is certain: he found the right kind of men, those drawn not by comfort but by challenge. It was, in every sense, a mad idea. And that's exactly why he wanted to do it. To carry this impossible dream, Shackleton needed a ship worthy of legend. Enter the Endurance, a masterpiece of Norwegian craftsmanship, a three-masted barquentine designed to crush through sea ice like a knife through glass. Built at the Framnes shipyard in 1912, she was sturdy yet elegant, her hull reinforced with greenheart wood, one of the toughest timbers on Earth. Her bow could withstand a direct hit from ice floes the size of houses, or so they thought. The crew numbered 28 in all: sailors, scientists, carpenters, and dreamers. Each man was chosen for grit as much as skill. There was Frank Worsley, the unflappable navigator from New Zealand with a sailor's intuition and a mathematician's precision. Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command, calm under pressure and fiercely devoted to the boss, as the men called Shackleton. Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter, a brilliant craftsman but notoriously stubborn, a man who could fix anything except his own temper. When the Endurance set sail from England in August 1914, war had just erupted in Europe. Shackleton even offered his ship and crew to the Admiralty, but they told him to go on. "Make your journey," they said. "We'll need heroes when you return." And so they sailed, 27 men and one black cat named Mrs. Chippy, heading south into the great white unknown. What was supposed to be a triumph of planning and endurance. Instead, it became a fight for survival. As the Endurance neared the Antarctic coast in January 1915, the first sign of trouble appeared, not in the form of storms or waves, but in silence. The sea began to freeze. Slowly, quietly, the ice sheets closed around the ship like the jaws of a great beast. The men chopped, pushed, cursed, and prayed, but the pack ice was relentless. Every night, the creaks of the hull sounded like groaning timbers begging for mercy. By February, they were locked in solid ice. By March, they had stopped moving entirely. The men watched in silence as the Endurance's hull buckled, splintered, and sank beneath the ice on November 21, 1915. Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica died that day, but something else was born in its place. The greatest survival story ever told. A century later, his ship, his lost companion, was found again. On March 5, 2022, a team of explorers from the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust discovered the Endurance nearly 10,000 feet beneath the surface of the Weddell Sea. The name Endurance could still be read on the stern, as if time itself had decided to preserve it. Its decks, ropes, and masts were still intact, protected by the freezing, oxygen-poor waters that warded off wood-eating parasites. "It's as if she sank yesterday," said expedition leader John Shears. And there it was, Shackleton's dream, frozen in time. The ship that symbolized human courage, patience, and defiance, rediscovered by modern explorers following the same stars and ice charts as their hero. Maritime archaeologist Menson Bound, who led the search, called it the finest wooden shipwreck ever seen. The wreck lies just 4 miles south of where Frank Worsley's notes said it would be, proof that Shackleton's men were as precise as they were brave. The find was more than history. It was a connection across time. When the underwater cameras first caught sight of the ship, some of the operators swore they saw movement in the darkness near it. Something large, shifting in the shadows. Scientists say it was just a trick of the light, maybe a drifting current. But still, the ocean keeps its secrets. The rediscovery of the Endurance was more than a triumph of technology. It was a resurrection of spirit. But as explorers watched the ghostly ship appear out of the black depths, one question returned like an echo across a century. What really happened to Shackleton and his men after the ice claimed their ship? Let's go back to how the story of the Endurance ended at the bottom of the sea, and where nature showed its teeth, and where Shackleton's true leadership was born. Trapped in ice, the white coffin. They had come so far, only to be stopped by silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a silence so heavy it pressed against the ears, broken only by the groaning of timber under stress. The Endurance had entered the Weddell Sea with hope in her sails. Now that hope was freezing solid. At first it didn't seem like much. A few thick sheets of ice bumping against the hull. Nothing the ship hadn't handled before. But the Weddell is deceptive. One day, open water. The next, an unending desert of white. Within days, the Endurance was no longer sailing. She was stuck, entombed in a frozen prison that stretched to the horizon. The men worked relentlessly, hammering, sawing, and hacking at the ice, their breath turning instantly to frost. The wind cut across the deck like knives. Shackleton stood watching, his coat stiff with frost and his jaw set. He urged his men to keep the ship moving, insisting that she was a living thing that must not be allowed to die still. The ice didn't just surround the Endurance, it gripped her. Every creak of the hull was a warning. Shackleton wrote in his diary, "The ship was being squeezed as if by a giant hand." Night after night, the sounds grew louder. Men woke in panic, thinking the deck might split beneath them. By October, the pressure was merciless. The hull twisted, beams cracked, and the masts bent like spears under invisible weight. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, ran his hand along a splintering board and whispered that she's dying. Then, on November 21, 1915, the Endurance gave up her fight. She heaved once, an awful guttural sound that the men would never forget, and then began to sink. Shackleton ordered them to abandon ship. They watched as the ice closed over her, the masts slowly vanishing, swallowed by the white. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by moving ice, they stood, 28 men, 3 lifeboats, a few sled dogs, and whatever supplies they could salvage. The dream of crossing Antarctica had ended. Now it was only about one thing: staying alive. They built camp on a large floe and named it Ocean Camp, a patch of snow and frozen sea that cracked and groaned beneath them. Temperatures fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Food was rationed to the ounce. The men hunted seals and penguins, melting ice for water, sleeping in tents that were constantly filled with frost. Shackleton's greatest battle wasn't with the ice, it was with despair. He knew if the men lost hope, they were done for, so he kept spirits alive with stories, songs, and strict routines. Every day had order: wake, breakfast, exercise, tasks, dinner. He said a cheerful spirit is the first requirement for survival. Still, the strain showed. Tempers flared. The carpenter, McNish, openly challenged Shackleton's authority, arguing that since the ship was gone, his contract had ended. Shackleton didn't shout. He simply reminded him and everyone else that leadership didn't depend on a ship. Then came the hardest order Shackleton ever gave. As rations dwindled, he made the call to shoot the sled dogs. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The ice shifted constantly, carrying them north but painfully slowly. They set up a second camp, Patience Camp, and waited, floating on a continent of moving death. Some nights the ice cracked without warning, splitting tents in two. The men scrambled with ropes, pulling boats and supplies to safety, sometimes knee-deep in slush. The constant movement made sleep a luxury. Shackleton's journal entries became both a record and a confession. By April 1916, even patience ran out. The floe beneath them began to break apart completely. There was no choice left but to launch the 3 lifeboats into the freezing sea. The men worked silently, faces gray with cold, pushing their fragile wooden craft into black water. The open sea was no salvation. It was another kind of hell. The small boats were constantly battered by waves, each man soaked to the bone. Salt water froze in their clothes, turning them into stiff shells. One boat disappeared during a storm, and Shackleton believed it lost forever, until it reappeared days later, emerging from fog like a ghost. The men were starving, frostbitten, and delirious, yet somehow still alive. They had spent over a year trapped, first by ice, then by the sea, and now, finally, they saw land, Elephant Island. It wasn't much, just a rocky, wind-blasted outcrop in the middle of nowhere, but to them, it was heaven. For the first time in 497 days, they stood on solid ground. Elephant Island was less a sanctuary than a cruel joke, a jagged, ice-crusted outcrop far from any shipping lane, a place no ship would ever find by chance. The men were free from the ice, yes, but stranded in one of the most God-forsaken corners of the earth. Their camp was a patch of frozen stones and bitter wind. They overturned the lifeboats and used them as roofs for makeshift huts, patching gaps with torn sails and penguin skins. Smoke from their blubber fires smeared their faces with soot. They slept beside the constant moan of the sea and woke to find frost in their beards and hunger gnawing their bellies. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, later said, "I don't think any of us have ever loved solid earth so much." Still, reality soon set in. Elephant Island was uninhabited, far off any shipping route. No one knew they were there. If they waited for rescue, they'd die waiting. Shackleton knew what had to be done. He would go for help himself. He chose 5 men, Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, Timothy McCarthy, John Vincent, and Harry McNish, and prepared one of the lifeboats, the James Caird. It was a tiny craft, barely fit for a lake. but it would have to cross the wildest stretch of ocean on Earth, 800 miles to South Georgia, where a whaling station might still stand. Shackleton climbed aboard and sailed into a wall of mist. Behind him, the men on Elephant Island waved their caps, cheering with voices cracked from cold and hunger. They believed in him because somehow he still believed in them. No one knew it then, but the worst was still ahead. The Southern Ocean would test Shackleton in ways no man had ever endured. But at that moment, on that desolate island, one thing was certain. If anyone could find salvation in the world's most hostile sea, it was Ernest Shackleton. The Voyage of the James Caird, a gamble against the sea. To the men left behind, Shackleton left Frank Wild in command, uttering the simple words that would burn into memory: "Keep the men alive until I return." On April 24, 1916, they pushed the James Caird into the gray surf. The sea hissed at their ankles like a warning. The others stood in silence as the little lifeboat disappeared into the fog, 6 dots of courage swallowed by the edge of the world. The first wave nearly capsized them. The next one reminded them what they were truly up against. The Southern Ocean is not a place for mercy. Its waves don't roll. They rise like walls. The wind howls with the voice of 1,000 storms. Salt spray froze the instant it touched their skin, turning ropes into iron and sails into brittle sheets. The men were constantly drenched, constantly freezing, and constantly bailing water to stop the Caird from sinking beneath their boots. Every few minutes someone shouted, "Water coming in!" And every man grabbed a tin or bucket, scooping for dear life. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. They huddled together under wet tarpaulins, bodies shivering uncontrollably, teeth rattling in rhythm with the waves. Their hands were swollen, raw, bleeding. Blisters froze into open wounds. When they managed to eat, it was cold biscuits or lumps of frozen seal meat. And yet, in that endless misery, there was laughter. Tom Crean, ever the heart of the crew, would shout over the wind, "Well, lads, at least it's not raining." Even Shackleton cracked a smile, but beneath the humor was unspoken fear. Every man knew that one mistake, one snapped rope, one wrong gust, one missed calculation, and the sea would devour them. Navigation was nearly impossible. Worsley, the navigator, waited for those rare moments when the clouds broke just long enough to glimpse the sun. Balancing his sextant on the lurching deck, waves smashing over him, he'd take a quick sighting and jot it down with shaking hands. If his reading was off by even 1 degree, they'd miss South Georgia entirely, doomed to drift forever in the empty Atlantic. After each attempt, Worsley would report that they were still on course. The men believed him because they had no other choice. Day after day, storm after storm, the Caird was tossed like a toy between mountains of water. Shackleton later wrote that they were a cork in an angry sea. At times, the boat seemed to stand on end before crashing down again in a chaos of spray and roar. Then, after 16 days of endless struggle, on May 8, 1916, McCarthy spotted something through the haze. Land to the east. The men cheered weakly, too spent to celebrate, but alive enough to feel the miracle. Salvation was there within reach, but of course the sea had one more card to play. As they approached, the wind rose again, a full hurricane this time, tearing at their sails and pushing them away from safety. For an entire day they fought it, the waves smashing over them with relentless fury. Later they learned that the same storm had sunk a steel ship 5 times their size. Yet somehow, miraculously, the James Caird survived. When the storm passed, they limped toward shore, the boat leaking badly, their strength nearly gone. The surf pounded the rocks, threatening to dash them to pieces. Shackleton shouted orders through the roar, and by some miracle of timing, they rode a wave straight onto the beach. They had made it. They had crossed 800 miles of the most dangerous sea on Earth, in a lifeboat. But the cruelest twist awaited them. The men crawled ashore on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations, their only hope of rescue, lay on the opposite coast. beyond a jagged spine of mountains and glaciers no one had ever crossed. Their boat was too battered to sail again. Rest was impossible. So Shackleton made another decision that defied all reason. He, Worsley, and Crean would cross the island on foot, through terrain unmapped and untraveled, to reach help. He turned to McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent and told them quietly that they would come back for them. And they believed him. They always did. The three men packed little: a rope, an adze, and a bit of food. No tents, no sleeping bags, just faith and endurance. They set off into the blizzard, climbing ice slopes by moonlight, sliding down glaciers they couldn't see the bottoms of, moving without pause for 36 hours straight. When at last they stumbled down the final ridge and heard the faint whistle of a steam engine from the whaling station below, Shackleton turned to Worsley and said softly, "We have done it." They had crossed an island no one else had dared. After crossing a sea no one else had survived. Against all odds, Shackleton had lived. But the true test of his leadership, and the full measure of his legend, would come in what happened next. Shackleton's heroic return and legacy. The man who refused to lose. Moments after encountering civilization, the three ragged men stumbled down into Stromness Bay. The whalers who spotted them from a distance were struck dumb. The figures approaching through the snow looked less like men and more like ghosts. Bearded, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags. One of the whalers stammered in disbelief as they reached the station door, demanding to know who the stranger was. As they reached the station door, one of the whalers stammered a question, asking who the stranger was. The man replied with quiet simplicity that he was Shackleton. In that instant, the impossible had been accomplished once more. Even with his own body battered and his beard still crusted with ice, Shackleton's mind turned instantly to one thing: the men left behind on Elephant Island. He barely paused to rest. Within hours, he arranged a small rescue boat to retrieve McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent, the three men still stranded on the far side of South Georgia. Once they were safe, he began planning the far greater challenge, getting all 22 men still waiting on Elephant Island. But the Antarctic, as always, wasn't done testing him. The first rescue attempt, aboard a Uruguayan trawler, failed when pack ice blocked their path. Shackleton could see Elephant Island in the distance, yet couldn't reach it. He watched through binoculars as the mountains vanished in fog, forced to turn back with dwindling fuel. A second attempt, this time on the schooner Emma, ended in disaster when the ship's engine failed. A third, aboard the ice-strengthened Discovery, was delayed by bureaucracy and bad weather. Each failure gnawed at him. He barely ate, barely slept, pacing the decks like a man possessed. "I could not content myself to wait," he wrote. 600 miles away, my comrades were in dire need. Finally, in August 1916, the Chilean government lent him a small, battered steamer, the Yelcho. Shackleton knew she wasn't built for Antarctic ice. Frankly, she wasn't built for much at all. But it was his last hope. He told the captain that if they failed this time, the men would be dead before spring. On August 25, they set out through freezing fog and treacherous seas. For 4 days, Shackleton barely left the bridge. The men on Elephant Island had been stranded for over 4 months since he'd left, subsisting on seal meat, penguin blubber, and sheer faith. Every morning, their leader in his absence, Frank Wild, would roll up his sleeping bag and say, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." And on August 30, 1916, he did. When the Yelcho appeared around the headland, 2 men collecting limpets on the beach froze in disbelief. "Ship! Ship!" they screamed, racing toward the camp. The others poured out of their makeshift hut, shouting, waving, lighting fires in the snow. Through binoculars, Shackleton saw them. Thinner, dirtier, but alive. He climbed into a small boat and rowed ashore himself. As he stepped onto the beach, Wild met him with eyes glistening with tears and quietly told him that everyone was safe. Shackleton nodded, his voice unsteady as he repeated the words, confirming that all were indeed safe. Not a single man had been lost. In less than an hour, the entire crew was aboard. As the Yelcho turned north, the men lined the rail, watching the bleak island shrink into the mist. Someone began humming softly, and soon laughter, real laughter, filled the air for the first time in nearly 2 years. Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, later wrote about the overwhelming relief of once again feeling the motion of the sea, hearing the sound of human voices, and knowing that their long ordeal and fears had finally come to an end. The Endurance expedition had failed in its original goal, crossing the Antarctic continent, but in every other way, it became one of the greatest survival stories ever told. Shackleton's name passed into legend, not because he conquered the pole, but because he refused to let his men die trying. His leadership style defied the conventions of his time. He led not with rank, but with empathy. He joked when morale was low, shared his last rations, and always made his men believe they could endure a little longer. When the expedition finally returned home, Shackleton was hailed as a hero. Scientists, explorers, and even military commanders studied his methods. His philosophy boiled down to a single line: optimism is true moral courage. In decades to come, that line would echo through classrooms, boardrooms, and survival schools. Business leaders cited him as the model of resilience under crisis. Naval officers studied his decisiveness and calm. Psychologists examined how he maintained morale in situations that should have broken men completely. And yet, Shackleton himself never stopped chasing the horizon. He launched another Antarctic expedition in 1921, this time aboard the Quest. But before the ship could reach the ice, his heart gave out. He died in his cabin near South Georgia, the same island that had witnessed his greatest triumph. His crew buried him there at Grytviken, overlooking the bay. On his gravestone are simple words that capture his spirit better than any speech. To the boss, who showed us what courage means. For the men who followed him and for the countless others who've read his story since, Shackleton became a symbol of what humans can do when everything else is lost, when endurance itself becomes the only map left. Even today, scientists and explorers draw inspiration from him. Astronauts study his leadership in space mission training. Corporate teams analyze his decision-making under pressure. And when modern explorers finally found the wreck of the Endurance, perfectly preserved beneath the ice a century later, it felt like the ship itself had been waiting to tell the story again, to remind us that hope, courage, and teamwork still matter in every age. A century later, that same unbreakable spirit of endurance would guide another mission, not across the ice, but beneath it. The search for endurance, ghosts beneath the ice. More than a century after Shackleton's Endurance vanished beneath the Antarctic ice, a new generation of explorers set out to find it, not for treasure, but for history. The icy wilderness that had swallowed the ship had never given up its secrets easily. Now, with cutting-edge science, millions of dollars in technology, and a healthy dose of human stubbornness, they were ready to try again. The mission began as a dream, part science, part obsession. Steve Santamore, a veteran expedition leader and deep-sea explorer, had spent his life pursuing the ghosts of lost ships. He had surveyed everything from the Titanic to Cold War submarines, but this expedition felt different. To him, Shackleton represented the very spirit of endurance, and finding the Endurance was more than an act of exploration. It was a tribute to the man who had come to embody the word itself. At his side was Menson Bound, the world-renowned marine archaeologist often called the Indiana Jones of the deep. Calm, deliberate, and endlessly fascinated by wooden shipwrecks, Bound had studied Shackleton's logs, old naval charts, and even weather data from 1915 to estimate where the Endurance might lie. He had been dreaming of this search for decades. And then there was Dr. Lasse Rabenstein, the mission's chief scientist, a geophysicist who knew the moods of Antarctic ice like old friends. Dangerous, unpredictable, and ever-shifting. He would lead the research side of the expedition, combining satellite data, sonar maps, and real-time ice drift models to guide the team through what Shackleton once called the worst sea on Earth. It took years to prepare. Engineers built autonomous underwater vehicles capable of diving nearly 10,000 feet into freezing darkness. Satellites mapped shifting ice flows. Weather experts modeled wind and sea currents down to the hour. And behind it all was a staggering $250 million operation, funded by research grants, sponsors, and private donors, part scientific endeavor, part historic pilgrimage. Their mission? To find the Endurance, perfectly preserved under layers of Antarctic ice, if the Weddell Sea allowed them to try. Calling the Weddell Sea unfriendly would be a monumental understatement. This corner of the Antarctic is notorious even among polar veterans. Ice moves like a living thing. Sheets the size of cities collide, drift, and crack with thunderous roars. The cold is relentless. Machines freeze. Steel warps. Even satellites struggle to see through the white haze. In 2019, the team made their first attempt. Spirits were high, the technology was new, optimism ran deep. But the Weddell Sea had other plans. During a deep dive, their $3 million AUV, the key to the whole mission, vanished. One moment it was transmitting data, the next silence. The sea had swallowed it whole. Santamore called the failure a punch to the heart. For days the crew searched tirelessly, scanning the ice for any trace of the lost machine, but found nothing. As the shifting floes began to close in and threaten to trap their icebreaker, Santamore made the same choice Shackleton once made: to retreat and survive to try again. He reminded his crew that the Antarctic was not a force to be conquered, but one that demanded respect and cooperation if they hoped to endure. Back home, the team regrouped. Bound rechecked Worsley's navigation notes, looking for tiny inconsistencies. Robinstein pored over satellite drift patterns to predict where the wreck might have shifted under the ice. For 3 long years, they rebuilt their tools, redesigned their AUVs, and replanned every mile of the search zone. The dream was far from dead. It was just waiting for the right moment. In February 2022, they came back, stronger, wiser, and more determined. Aboard the South African icebreaker Agulhas II, a floating laboratory bristling with technology, a crew of 63 experts assembled: oceanographers, meteorologists, engineers, divers, historians, and polar field guides. Together, they would take on what Santamore called a moon landing beneath the ice. The Weddell Sea welcomed them in its usual way, with blizzards, sub-zero winds, and seas that could turn from glass to chaos in minutes. Yet the Agulhas II held firm, carving paths through ice fields that glittered under the polar sun. Inside the ship, screens flickered with sonar feeds as AUVs dove thousands of feet down, weaving through submerged valleys of black silence. Chief Scientist Rabenstein and his team worked around the clock at a 24-hour ice desk, tracking ice drift using satellite images and radar data. The AUVs worked like mechanical explorers, scanning the seabed with lasers and sonar. They could operate for 8 hours at a time, tracing grids across the sea floor. Each dive brought tension. Would they find something? Would the ice close in again? On board, coffee was endless, nerves stretched thin, and hope hung in the air like frost. Then, one night in early March, something flickered on a screen. The sonar image was faint at first, a ghostly outline half buried in darkness. Then it sharpened, a wooden hull intact, upright, as if frozen in time. The stern came into focus, and there, carved clearly into the beam, was a single word glowing through the sediment: endurance. Silence filled the control room. A few gasps, a few tears. Even Santamore, who'd seen a lifetime of discoveries, just stood there, speechless. They had found it. Menson Bound later called it the best-preserved wooden shipwreck he's ever seen. Despite resting nearly 10,000 feet deep, the ship looked astonishingly whole. The masts stood tall, rigging still in place, the wheel visible through the debris. Even the brasswork gleamed under the submersible's lights. The freezing temperatures, lack of oxygen, and absence of wood-eating bacteria had kept it almost exactly as it was when Shackleton last saw it in 1915. After more than 100 years, the Endurance had endured. But the expedition wasn't only about finding a ship. As the scientists celebrated, work continued. Dr. Robinstein and his ice research team collected data on how climate change was reshaping Antarctica's frozen seas. Engineers monitored how the Agulhas II resisted the crushing ice, feeding information into models that could design safer polar vessels in the future. The mission was rewriting not just Shackleton's history, but the future of polar science itself. For the subsea team, the achievement carried a deeply personal weight. Nico Vincent, one of the engineers, often remarked that working beneath drifting ice was even more challenging than landing on the moon, yet they had accomplished it. To many, the expedition stood as a powerful reminder of why humanity continues to explore, to push the boundaries of courage, patience, and imagination in the face of the unknown. A few days later, the crew sailed to Grytvik in South Georgia, where Shackleton was buried. They stood by his grave in the snow, raised a toast, and laid a wreath that read, "For the boss, your ship has been found." Bound said it was one of the most emotional moments of his life. A century apart, two expeditions had met across time, the explorers of the past and those of the present, bound by the same unbreakable spirit. From Shackleton's frozen grave to the glowing images on a computer screen, the line connecting past and present couldn't be clearer. Technology may change, tools may evolve, but the human drive to explore, to persevere, and to endure, that never fades. A century ago, Shackleton proved that courage could defy nature. In 2022, a team of explorers proved it again, this time with machines and satellites instead of sails and sextants. And as the ice closed once more over the resting place of the Endurance, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. A reminder that some legends don't sink, they simply wait. What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.